My boots pounded against the cracked tile floor of the old hospital wing, abandoned since 1980. My flashlight swept across walls dark with mold while my breath came hard, mixing with the thunder rolling over the Montana mountains outside. An anonymous call at 2 in the morning had brought me there, along with a warning that left no room for delay. If you're not here in 10 minutes, something that doesn't belong in this world is going to die. I ran down the endless hallway, pushing past rusted hospital carts. When I reached the emergency room door at the far end, I drew one deep breath and shoved it open. The door flew wide, and what I saw made 26 years of veterinary experience feel useless. On a narrow hospital bed lay a massive Bigfoot more than 8 feet tall, his chest rising in painful, uneven pulls. Dark black hair was matted with blood. 2 enormous 5-fingered hands, each as large as a strong man's, gripped the clean white sheets. This was Bigfoot, the legend I had always dismissed as nonsense, fighting for breath and asking for help through desperate amber eyes. Hello, I'm Victor. Welcome back to Bigfoot Sasquatch Stories. Tonight's account is a work of creative fiction, inspired by one of the strangest reports ever imagined along the boundary between science and legend. Don't forget to hit subscribe. Now, let's step into the operation that changed Eleanor's life forever. 12 years earlier, on a night in the middle of September, Dr. Eleanor Marsh had nearly reached the end of what she could handle before the clinic phone rang. She was 58 when she later told the story. But when it happened, Eleanor was only 46 and still insisted on handling most major emergencies herself instead of leaving them to the younger veterinarian on night duty. 26 years in the profession had trained her to remain almost hard-edged around blood, roaring, claws, and bodies weighing hundreds of pounds, thrashing in pain. Even so, that night began with a very ordinary kind of human exhaustion, the kind that makes every decision after 2 in the morning feel questionable. Eleanor's clinic stood outside Missoula, where the neighborhoods thinned into pasture, feed sheds, and roads leading toward the foothills. The sign at the entrance clearly stated that she treated large animals and wildlife. Most of her clients were farms in the area that kept horses, cattle, and mules. From time to time, Montana Fish and Wildlife called her for more difficult cases. A black bear with a leg injured in a fence, a wolf struck by a vehicle, or an elk exhausted after falling into an irrigation canal. Eleanor was not an official agency employee, but her name remained on the list of people who could be called when they needed a veterinarian familiar with large animals, able to work in the field, and unlikely to panic when proper equipment was unavailable. That day had begun before sunrise. The first case was a mare struggling through a difficult birth at a farm west of Missoula. After that, Eleanor returned to the clinic to treat a deep cut on the leg of a breeding bull, then drove nearly an hour to examine a young bear brought in by game wardens inside a transport cage. It was close to midnight before she finished the paperwork, disinfected her instruments, and turned off most of the lights. Her shoulders felt weighted with lead. The rubber gloves had left marks around her wrists. Her last cup of coffee sat cold on the desk beside a stack of notes she planned to deal with in the morning. She lived in a small house attached to the back of the clinic, a convenient arrangement for work and a terrible one for sleep. Eleanor was used to the telephone, pulling her away from dinner, the shower, or one of the rare quiet nights she managed to get. Still, she had firm rules for after-hours calls. The caller had to provide a name, location, species, basic condition, and any safety risk at the scene. With wildlife, she always required a game warden or trained officer to accompany her. Eleanor had seen too many people underestimate an animal in pain to believe personal experience alone was enough. That night, she locked the treatment area, checked the anesthesia cabinet, and headed toward the house. She traded her dusty lab coat for an old sweater, washed her face, and set the alarm for 6:30. She had just pulled the blanket over herself when the clinic's landline rang. The sound echoed through the dark hallway, steady and insistent. Eleanor looked at the clock beside the bed. 2 o'clock in the morning. She stayed still through the first 3 rings. Real emergencies usually kept calling. On the 4th, she sat up, slipped her feet into a pair of house shoes, and walked down the hallway. The motion lights in the back section came on, throwing a cold light across the floor. Eleanor picked up the receiver with her left hand while her right rubbed the stiffness at the back of her neck. Marsh Veterinary Clinic. A man answered immediately, without asking whether he had reached the right number. "I need the doctor here now. My patient is losing blood." His voice was low, clear, and so controlled that Eleanor became fully awake at once. He was not gasping, stumbling over words, or surrounded by panicked voices. She heard wind crossing the line and a faint layer of static, as if the call came from somewhere with poor service. Eleanor pulled out a chair, sat down, and reached for a pen. "What's your name?" "Cole." "Cole what?" A short silence followed. The man did not hang up, but he did not answer either. Eleanor changed direction. "What kind of animal is the patient?" "I can't say over the phone. Just bring everything you have. You're going to need it." The answer irritated her. She had dealt with panicked ranchers, hunters afraid of being fined, and people hiding illegally kept wildlife. Those callers often avoided questions, but their voices usually carried tension. Cole was different. His calm did not sound careless. It sounded like a man who had decided to give only the information he believed was necessary and nothing more. Eleanor touched the tip of the pen to the paper. "Is the patient conscious?" "Yes." "Breathing rate?" "Labored." "Irregular." "Where's the wound?" "Lower abdomen." "Gunshot?" "No steel trap?" "No vehicle strike?" "I don't know." Eleanor frowned. "Size?" This time, Cole paused longer. When he answered, his voice dropped. "Large?" "Large, like a horse? A bear? A bison?" "Larger than anything you normally treat." Eleanor sat straighter. The statement might have been an exaggeration from someone who did not understand animal size, but the way Cole formed each word made her doubt it. She asked how many people were at the location, whether the area was secure, and whether the animal had been restrained. Cole only said there was a place to work, there were people available to help, and the patient was not dangerous as long as Eleanor stayed calm. "Where are you?" Cole gave her the name of a meeting point near the edge of Bitterroot National Forest, about 2 hours from the clinic if the roads were clear. Eleanor knew the general area. It lay far from the main tourist routes, close to an old forest road often used by hunters in the fall. Cole told her to stop at a small clearing beside a locked wooden gate, turn off her headlights, and wait. Someone would lead her from there. "Who's the guide?" "I am." "So you're not with the patient now? I'll be back before you arrive." Eleanor looked down at the page. Every answer created another question. "Why can't you bring the animal here? It can't be moved that far. Call search and rescue. No, call a game warden." Nobu Cole's voice remained controlled, but for the first time there was a hard weight behind the word. Eleanor heard a low sound on the other end of the line, maybe branches striking together or something shifting close to the phone. Cole went quiet for several seconds, then spoke faster. "Dr. Marsh, I know this isn't a normal request. I know you have every reason to refuse. But if you don't come, the patient won't survive the night." Eleanor tightened her grip on the pen. "How do you know my name? People here know who can help." "What people?" Cole did not answer directly. "You've worked with grizzlies and bison. You have a field surgery kit. You've operated without electricity." She asked for a number where she could call him back. Cole said the line he was using was unreliable. He repeated the meeting point and told her to bring sedatives, heavy suture material, intravenous fluids, hemostats, and backup flashlights. The list was too specific for a prank. It also showed that the caller understood Eleanor might have to perform major treatment far from a proper operating room. "Bring everything you have," Cole said again. "You're going to need it." Then the line went dead. Eleanor kept the receiver against her ear for several more seconds. Only the steady dial tone remained. She placed the phone down, looked at the page filled with unanswered questions, and told herself she was not going. Every safety rule she had ever used argued against it. The caller had not provided a full name, had not identified the species, refused to involve a game warden, and wanted her to meet him alone in an isolated place at night. If one of her younger employees had described a call like that, Eleanor would have ordered the doors locked and the county sheriff notified. 2:17 in the morning. Eleanor called the number shown on the phone. There was no connection. She searched for the name Cole in her client records and wildlife contacts. Several people shared the name, but none matched the area. She considered calling the county sheriff's office, then stopped before entering the number. Cole had made it clear that he did not want anyone else's arriving. It could involve illegal hunting or an animal being hidden from authorities. Going alone could walk her straight into trouble. Bringing law enforcement could cause a frightened person to abandon an injured animal. Cole had said the patient was conscious, breathing hard, wounded in the abdomen, losing blood. Those details repeated in her mind, separate from the mystery surrounding them. Beneath every question about the caller and location, there was still a body growing weaker by the minute. Eleanor understood exactly what that meant. If a major blood vessel or internal organ had been damaged, a 2-hour drive was already dangerous. Waiting longer only to achieve perfect safety could turn the call into a death notice. She decided to create the few protections she still could. Eleanor wrote the location on another sheet of paper, added the time she planned to leave, and placed it beneath the computer keyboard. She left a voicemail for a colleague named Martin, saying she was heading to an emergency near Bitterroot and would call before 8 in the morning. She did not mention Cole, because she was not certain that was his real name. Then she took bear spray, a handheld radio, a heavy jacket, and a headlamp. In the medication room, Eleanor prepared the way she always did before an unknown case. She took the large surgical kit, hemostats, curved needles, heavy sutures, scalpels, scissors, sterile gauze, and antiseptic solution. She added 2 bags of intravenous fluids, tubing, pressure bandages, pain medication, antibiotics, and the sedatives she normally used for large animals. Since she did not know the species or weight, she packed more options than usual, along with handwritten dosage charts for horses, cattle, bears, and bison. She would need all of it. But Eleanor was not thinking about Cole at the moment she made the decision. She was thinking about a chest struggling to rise somewhere inside the Bitterroot Mountains. She thought about the time remaining before the blood loss became irreversible. A doctor cannot save every life. But Eleanor had never learned how to sleep when she knew she had not tried. She opened the vehicle, placed the equipment cases on the back seat, and secured them with straps. The September air was colder than she expected. To the south, the mountain range showed only as a dark mass beneath the moonless sky. Eleanor started the engine, checked the fuel, and entered the meeting point, into the navigation unit. The route ran across an empty highway, before narrowing toward the forest. She checked the rear-view mirror. The clinic receded behind her, the yard light shrinking into a small yellow point. Eleanor reminded herself that if anything at the meeting place looked dangerous, she would turn around immediately. But that promise did not settle the uneasiness inside her. Something in Cole's voice made her believe that once she saw the patient, turning back might no longer be a choice she could make. The clinic lights disappeared from the mirror. Ahead, the road toward Bitterroot was completely empty. Eleanor kept both hands on the wheel and continued driving, even though every safety rule she had ever made was telling her to turn back. Eleanor left Missoula just after 2:20 in the morning. The road south stretched ahead as a narrow black strip between dark fields. At first, scattered lights from homes still appeared along both sides. But the closer she came to the Bitterroot Mountains, the farther apart those lights became until they disappeared completely, leaving only the headlights sweeping across cold pavement and reflective signs in the night. She drove for nearly 2 hours and saw almost no other vehicles. When the navigation unit directed her off the main road and onto a narrow gravel route, her phone signal flickered, then disappeared. Low branches scraped both sides of the vehicle. Potholes became more frequent, many of them filled with rainwater. Eleanor had to slow down to keep the equipment cases in the back from striking each other. The mountains to her right rose like a dark wall, heavy and closer with every curve. Eleanor knew the area was large enough for someone to disappear for days without being found. She had assisted with rescues near the edge of Bitterroot before. But she had never gone this deep at night with a man who refused to tell her what kind of patient was waiting. Close to 4 in the morning, her headlights reached an old wooden gate blocking the road. Beside it was a small clearing, barely large enough for 2 vehicles. There was no house, no sign, and no signal light. Eleanor stopped, pulled the parking brake, and turned off the headlights as instructed. Darkness pressed against the windows at once. The engine continued running beneath the floor, but the sound did little to calm her. She looked at the clock, checked the rearview mirror, then rested one hand on the bear spray inside her coat pocket. She waited almost 5 minutes. During that time, every professional safety rule returned with perfect clarity. No one at the clinic knew exactly where she was. The caller had not provided a full name, had not confirmed his identity, and had refused to allow a game warden to come. Eleanor reminded herself that the first sign of danger would send her straight back down the road. Just as she began to think Cole would not appear, a small light moved between the trees on the left. It stayed low to the ground and did not look like vehicle headlights. A man stepped out of the forest, carrying a flashlight pointed downward so it would not shine directly into the cab. He walked slowly, with his free hand kept outside his coat. Eleanor lowered the window only a few inches and asked him to confirm his name. The man nodded, called her by name, then looked toward the back seat where the equipment cases were packed tightly together. Dashboard light showed Eleanor that he was in his 50s, broad through the chest, with a short beard streaked with gray. He wore a dark brown waxed jacket, outdoor pants, high boots, and a knit cap pulled low. There was no badge or name tag. Cole said they would have to continue on foot, and that the walk would take more than an hour if they kept a steady pace. He said it calmly, as if describing an ordinary part of the job. Eleanor demanded more information before leaving the vehicle. Cole still refused to name the species, but he confirmed that no person had been injured, no weapons were present, and the patient was too weak to be dangerous as long as she did not frighten him. He also said the patient could not be transported to the clinic and that calling more people could make the situation worse. The answers did not remove her suspicion, but they did not sound invented either. Cole did not try to persuade her with dramatic language. He only repeated that she would understand once she saw the patient. The exhaustion under his eyes and the way he kept looking back toward the forest caught her attention. At last, Eleanor shut off the engine and stepped outside. The September air was colder than she had expected. The smell of wet soil, pine resin, and fallen leaves surrounded the clearing. Cole opened the back door and lifted the largest surgical case with both hands. Eleanor put on the medical backpack, held the sedative bag close to her body, and carried another smaller case containing intravenous fluids. Before leaving the vehicle, she placed a note on the driver's seat with the arrival time, a short description of Cole, and the direction they were taking into the forest. She locked the vehicle, checked the radio at her side, then followed Cole around the wooden gate. The trail beyond the gate was so narrow that it nearly disappeared beneath grass and low branches. For the first 10 minutes, the ground remained fairly level and was covered with thick pine needles that made their footsteps almost silent. Cole stayed about 6 feet ahead, held his flashlight low, and chose every step carefully. Eleanor followed his boot marks to avoid roots and hidden holes. He barely spoke. Most of the time, Cole only gave short warnings about the ground: low branch, slick rock, exposed root, soft earth, or where she should step across. The warnings always came at the right moment. Once, Eleanor was about to place her foot on a flat patch of moss when Cole signaled her to stop. Beneath it was a deep gap between 2 rocks, wide enough to twist her ankle. After about 20 minutes, the trail began climbing. The pines thinned and gave way to exposed stone, and brush pressed close against the mountainside. The backpack dug into Eleanor's shoulders, and the fluid case pulled her right arm down. Cole kept the same steady pace, even though the surgical case in his hands was heavier than anything she carried. The route did not follow any obvious trail. Sometimes they moved along an old path. Other times, Cole suddenly turned through a group of trees. Guided by signs Eleanor could barely see: a low broken branch, 3 stones placed beside one another, a scrape on the trunk of a fir. He needed only one glance before changing direction, as though he had traveled this way many times. They crossed a narrow creek running hard between black rocks. Cole set down the surgical case, carried the other bags across first, then showed Eleanor 2 safe places to step. When she crossed, he held close to her elbow just long enough to catch her if she slipped, then immediately released her. After the creek, she asked whether he worked for the Forest Service, a hunting group, or search and rescue. He only said he had once hunted in the region, but no longer did. When Eleanor asked directly who he was, Cole stayed quiet for a moment, then said he knew those who had lived there longer than anyone else. The vague answer made her want to press him, but the ground ahead did not allow it. The trail narrowed into a shelf of earth crossing the mountainside. On the right, a rock wall rose to shoulder height. On the left, the slope dropped into darkness beyond the reach of their lights. Cole told her to place the fluid case inside the backpack, keep one hand on the exposed roots, and move sideways in his tracks. The wind blew harder along the ledge. It passed through Eleanor's coat and stiffened her fingers with cold. She focused completely on staying balanced. One stone loosened beneath her heel, rolled over the edge, and disappeared without making any sound below. It was there that Eleanor understood how completely she depended on Cole. She no longer knew which direction led back to the vehicle. The navigation unit had no signal, the radio gave only static, and the trail behind them had vanished. If Cole walked away, she might not find her way back before daylight. If he had deliberately led her in the wrong direction, no one would know where to search. Cold sweat gathered beneath her clothes, even as the air grew sharper. Every step forward made the return seem farther away, but the groaning ahead pulled her faster, reminding her that hesitation could now cost a life. The thought tightened her stomach. Still, Cole's behavior did not match that of a man preparing to harm her. He carried the heaviest case, kept checking Eleanor's pace, and warned her about every dangerous section. His secrecy frightened her, but his care kept her moving. Beyond the ledge, the forest became thicker and wetter. Ancient cedar and fir trees grew close together, their trunks wide and dark. Beneath the canopy, low brush nearly disappeared. The ground was covered with pine needles, rotting wood, and clusters of pale mushrooms. The air smelled of cold water and bark. Cole slowed noticeably. He began stopping often, tilting his head to listen, before continuing. Eleanor became quiet as well. At first, she heard only wind and distant water. Then, During a break between two gusts, a low sound carried through the trees. It was not exactly a roar. It sounded like a deep groan, drawn from a very large chest that was losing strength. Distance and trees softened it, but the broken rhythm at the end immediately made Eleanor think of breathing restricted by pain or blood loss. She stopped and looked at Cole. He only confirmed that they were close. For the first time, the calm in his face cracked. His jaw tightened and his pace became faster. The sound came again, weaker than before. Eleanor's professional instincts pushed past the fear. At once, she checked the sedative bag and asked about the pressure dressing, the amount of blood lost, and whether the patient could keep water down. Cole said the wound had been compressed temporarily. The bleeding had slowed, but the patient could not keep water down. Those first useful medical details confirmed that the phone call had not exaggerated the emergency. A large animal losing blood, over time, could collapse quickly. Eleanor forgot some of the weight of the backpack and increased her pace. There was a real emergency ahead, and every delayed minute could make a difference. The trail began descending into a narrow hollow. They climbed over a large fallen tree, circled a moss-covered rock wall, then passed beneath fir branches so low they had to bend at the waist. After almost 1 hour and 10 minutes from the vehicle, Eleanor saw a small point of yellow light between the trees ahead. The light did not move. As they came closer, it became an oil lamp shining through a window in a low cabin nearly hidden beneath the forest canopy. Moss and pine needles covered the wooden roof. There was no vehicle road, fence, or sign that would appear on a map. One window cast weak light across the ground near the porch. Everything around the cabin was so quiet that Eleanor could hear her own breathing. Cole set the surgical case on the step, then looked at her longer than he had at any point before. He told her to remain calm when she entered. It did not sound like a threat. It sounded like the final preparation for someone about to see something that could never be unseen. Eleanor stood behind him, cold, exhausted, and completely lost inside the Bitterroot Mountains. From inside the cabin came a low groan, deeper than any sound she had heard from a bear, bison, or elk. The thin wooden wall trembled lightly with it. She rested one hand on the clasp of the medical bag and worked to keep her breathing even. Every fear about Cole, the route back, and the safety rules she had broken remained. But they were pushed aside by a simpler truth. Whoever lay behind that door was in pain and running out of time. Cole lifted the surgical case and placed one hand on the door latch. If you are wondering what Eleanor found at the end of that trail, hit subscribe right now. Because the next part is the moment that changed the rest of her career. A like also helps me continue bringing you stories like this. Now, let's step inside that cabin. Cole pushed the wooden door inward, and a thick wave of heat rolled out at once, carrying the smell of burning oil, wet hair, damp soil, and the faint metallic scent Eleanor knew from cases involving blood loss. She crossed the threshold while still gripping the strap of her equipment bag. The cabin was smaller than she expected, with a low ceiling, dark wooden walls, and no electricity. 3 oil lamps provided the only light. Their flames flickered and made every shadow stretch, then shrink across the walls. In the middle of the cabin stood an unusually long wooden table. It was not a dining table or an improvised surgical table. Diagonal braces reinforced all 4 legs. The surface was thick and rough, marked by old cuts and hardened tree sap. 2 large stone blocks had been placed beneath it. Eleanor understood that someone had prepared the table ahead of time to hold a weight far beyond a human body. On that table lay her patient. For the first few seconds, Eleanor could not take another step. The Bigfoot lay on his left side, his back close to the wall and both legs slightly bent because his body was longer than the table. If he stood upright, his head would almost certainly reach the low ceiling beams. Eleanor estimated his height at more than 8.5 feet, possibly close to 9 feet, if his back were fully straightened. His shoulders nearly filled the entire width of the table. His right arm hung close to the edge, and the huge hand almost touched the floor. The fingers were long, thick, and curled slightly from tension, with dark nails that did not resemble claws. Hair covered almost his entire body, dark brown with gray mixed across the chest, belly, and sides. The hair on his shoulders and arms was long, tangled, and clumped from sweat. Around the lower right abdomen, dried blood had formed dark patches, mixed with areas that remained wet under the oil lamps. His body carried a strong smell of damp forest, rotting bark, cold earth, and the sour heat of fever. Eleanor heard the breathing before she dared look directly at his face. Every breath in was deep, heavy, and prolonged, then broke into a faint rasp. There were short pauses before the enormous chest rose again. The breathing was fast, uneven, and showed clear exhaustion. Cole placed the case on the floor, but Eleanor barely heard it. Her full attention was held by the face on the table. The face was familiar and strange at the same time, leaving her mind with no clear place to put it. A heavy brow ridge, low forehead, and a nose broader and flatter than a human nose. The jaw was large and strong, but did not extend like a bear's muzzle. Hair on the cheeks and chin was shorter than on the head, exposing gray-brown skin beneath it. Small ears sat close against the sides of the skull. Thin silver hairs appeared around the temples and jaw, making the Bigfoot look fully mature and well into adulthood. Dark brown eyes rested half open and fixed directly on Eleanor. She had looked into the eyes of grizzlies struck by vehicles, wolves caught in traps, and horses exhausted by pain. This look was different. It held pain, caution, and deliberate awareness. The Bigfoot was not only noticing the stranger who had entered the cabin. He was studying her and understood that her arrival was connected to what would happen next. Eleanor's throat went dry. 26 years of practice had given her many points of reference. She knew how to approach an injured bear, read the posture of a wolf, and estimate danger from the breathing and muscle tension of a bison. Every part of that knowledge came from anatomy, drug dosages, and behaviors that had already been studied. Nothing had prepared her for the body on that table. One part of Eleanor immediately denied what her eyes were showing her. Maybe this was a human with an extreme form of abnormal hair growth. Maybe the oil light and exhaustion had distorted the size. But the shoulders were too wide, the arms too long, and the feet too human in form, while several times too large. The chest was also far beyond the proportions of an ordinary person. Eleanor remained near the door, her body rigid as if some unseen force held her in place. Cole did not rush her. He stood on the other side of the table, holding an oil lamp higher so more light fell across the abdomen. His silence gave Eleanor time to face the impossible. The patient did not have the same luxury. A deep groan came from the Bigfoot's throat. It was not loud, but it passed through the table and into the wooden floor beneath Eleanor's feet. His right arm pulled inward, and the hand closed around the table's edge. The fingers dug into the wood and left fresh marks across the surface. His abdomen tightened. His entire body shook lightly, then relaxed. That sound brought Eleanor back to herself. The disbelief remained, but professional instinct moved ahead of it. She did not need the patient's scientific name to recognize blood loss, acute pain, and the risk of shock. She did not need to know the species to understand that the breathing was getting worse. Questions about origin, existence, or scientific meaning could wait. A life was weakening in front of her. Eleanor moved closer to the table. She set down the equipment bag, removed her outer coat, and pulled gloves from the front pocket of the backpack. Every motion was slow and deliberate, so she would not frighten the patient. She did not stare into his eyes, but she did not turn away either. Her voice stayed low, and even, almost the same tone she used to calm an injured horse. She said she needed to examine the wound and would not touch him until he could see her hands. There was no clear change in his face, but the eyes followed Eleanor's hands. She moved to the right side of the table. At close range, his size became even harder to accept. The chest was broader than that of a full-grown black bear, with heavy shoulder muscles and a forearm almost as thick as Eleanor's thigh. But that immense body now gave only the impression of something failing from within. Eleanor brought one gloved hand near his right arm, then stopped a few inches from the hair. The Bigfoot looked down at it, then back at her. There was no roar, no attempt to pull away. She touched lightly near the wrist, where the hair was thinner, and searched for a pulse. The skin beneath the hair was hotter than normal. The pulse was strong but fast, and not entirely regular. Eleanor counted silently, feeling each beat beneath her fingertips. The rate matched blood loss, pain, and fever. She moved to examine the color inside the lip, doing so with extreme care. The Bigfoot tightened his jaw but did not resist. The tissue was paler than healthy tissue should have been, another sign that his circulating blood volume had dropped significantly. Eleanor signaled Cole to raise the lamp. The wound lay along the lower right abdomen and was almost as long as her forearm. Someone had cut away the surrounding hair in a rough manner, probably with a knife or hunting scissors. A clean cloth had been pressed over the wound and secured by strips tied around the hips. As Eleanor slowly removed the dressing, the smell of old blood and damaged tissue became stronger. She studied it before touching anything deeper. The wound did not have the rounded edge or burn pattern of a bullet, and it did not have the clean line of a knife. The margins were irregular, with bruising and several deep punctures set at uneven distances. The shape suggested impact with something sharp or the bite of a large animal. The spacing was too wide for a wolf. A grizzly was more likely, but Eleanor could not be certain. More important, blood still seeped from one point deep inside. The surface was not pouring, but every contraction of the abdominal muscles pushed out another small amount. Slow, prolonged bleeding like this could be as dangerous as obvious hemorrhage because people often underestimated the damage. Eleanor pressed carefully around the area, checking for swelling, trapped air beneath the skin, or signs of internal injury. The abdominal muscle was so dense that examination was more difficult than it would have been on a bear. The Bigfoot tightened his body when she touched near the lower edge of the wound, but instead of pushing her away, he gripped the table harder. Another groan came out, low and broken. Eleanor stopped immediately and allowed him to recover his breathing. She noticed that Cole had placed a round piece of wood beside the patient's left hand. Fresh, deep dents covered the surface, as though the fingers had squeezed it many times. The Bigfoot moved his hand to the wood and gripped it, using the object to control his response to pain instead of struggling. That detail affected Eleanor in a different way. Animals in pain usually withdrew, bit, clawed, or fought to escape. Choosing to hold an object in order to restrain the body showed control far beyond simple reflex. The Bigfoot understood that Eleanor was causing pain, yet he was still allowing her to continue. She looked into his eyes again. The gaze remained alert, but the exhaustion had deepened. The eyelids were heavy, and the pupils reacted slowly beneath the lamp. There was a wordless question in those eyes, or perhaps Eleanor was placing human meaning onto something she did not yet understand. Even so, she felt a fragile permission. The Bigfoot did not fully trust her, but he had chosen not to resist. Eleanor gave her first assessment in short sentences. The patient had lost a large amount of blood, showed signs of shock, and had a deep injury through the abdominal wall. She needed to clean the wound, control the bleeding, inspect the muscle layers, then close each layer separately. If an internal organ had been damaged, his chance of survival would fall sharply. Cole listened without interrupting. He moved when instructed, brought boiled water, opened clean cloths, and placed the oil lamps closer. Beside the small iron stove were several pots of water, glass bottles, fabric towels, and a stack of firewood. The cabin had no electricity, but it was not completely unprepared. Someone had done everything possible before Eleanor arrived. She asked when the injury had occurred. Cole said the Bigfoot had appeared near the cabin late in the afternoon, already weak and bleeding badly. He had not seen the attack, but had found a large area of disturbed ground in the forest, and hair from another animal caught on low branches. As far as he knew, the wound had not been caused by a person. Eleanor did not ask how a Bigfoot knew to come to the cabin, or why Cole already had a table strong enough to hold him and supplies ready for a temporary dressing. Those questions were forming a long line in her mind, but every passing minute took more strength from the patient. She opened the surgical case. Metal reflected the oil light in pale yellow lines. Eleanor arranged clamps, scissors, suture material, syringes, and gauze in the order she knew. Touching instruments she had used thousands of times steadied her mind. The world might have just revealed something impossible, but steel was still steel. Bleeding still had to be stopped, and wounds still had to be cleaned. She measured the breathing again, checked the pulse, and estimated weight based on body length, chest size, and muscle density. The number that came to mind made Eleanor understand that every familiar dosage would have to be recalculated. A small error for a horse could become a dangerous error in a body that had never been described. The Bigfoot turned his head slightly toward her. Under the oil lamps, the features of his face became clearer. He did not resemble the monster shown in sensational drawings. His size could inspire fear, but his face carried unmistakable signs of age, exhaustion, and real pain. An old scar ran from the cheekbone toward the jaw. A few silver hairs clung to the sweat on his forehead. His eyes continued following Eleanor, not begging in the way people understood begging, but also not closing in surrender. That moment ended the struggle inside her. Eleanor was no longer standing before evidence that needed classification. She was no longer confronting the question of what science had missed inside the forests of Montana. Those thoughts could return later if both of them survived until morning. For now, she had one patient, a very large, very weak patient who was placing his life in the hands of a stranger. Eleanor pulled a low stool toward the table, tightened the gloves around her wrists, and told Cole to hold the lamp steady over the abdomen. She prepared the medication, cleaned the skin around the wound, and placed the instruments within reach. Every movement became more certain, as though 26 years of experience had finally found a place inside a room that belonged to no textbook. Outside, wind crossed the cabin roof and moved branches against the walls. Inside, the oil flame leaned whenever air slipped through the cracks. Eleanor's shadow stretched across the floor, beside the shadow of the enormous hand tightening around the piece of wood. She placed her fingertips near the edge of the wound, drew a deep breath, and began the work of saving him. Eleanor began by turning the rough wooden table into an orderly work area. Inside a cabin without electricity, everything had to depend on memory, professional habit, and whatever steadiness remained in her hands. After nearly a full day without sleep, she spread clean cloths around the abdomen, arranged the clamps, scissors, suture material, and syringes in their familiar order, then told Cole to hold the oil lamp at a fixed angle. The pale yellow light was weak, but it was all they had. The patient remained on his side, his chest rising with effort. Each breath lasted longer than it should have, as though his body had to push past some invisible resistance before air could reach the lungs. His left hand still rested around the round piece of wood beside him. The huge fingers were not fully closed, but the deep dents in the surface showed he had already squeezed it many times before Eleanor arrived. The first task was controlling pain and reducing movement. With any large patient, sedation was a balance between going deep enough to treat the wound and staying safe enough not to collapse the breathing. But the body in front of Eleanor did not belong to any dosage chart she had ever studied. If she guessed too low, the Bigfoot could wake fully while she was working in the deeper tissue. If she gave too much, his already weakened breathing might slow beyond recovery. She worked from 2 points of experience. Grizzlies gave her one reference for how a large omnivore might respond to sedatives. Bison gave her another for circulatory strength and the risk of falling blood pressure in a heavy body that had lost blood. Between those two, Eleanor built a temporary safety range of her own. She started below the amount she believed might be needed, then divided the rest into smaller doses so she could watch the reaction step by step. Cole held the lamp while Eleanor chose a muscle area on the outer shoulder, where the hair had been moved aside. She cleaned the skin, inserted the needle, and gave the first dose. The patient only tightened the shoulders slightly. His hand closed around the wood, hard enough to produce a small cracking sound. But he did not turn, swing an arm, or try to leave the table. She counted the breaths, felt the pulse at the wrist, and watched the pupils. After several minutes, the shoulder muscles loosened, but his eyes remained alert. She gave a second dose, smaller than the first. This time the eyelids lowered farther, the breathing slowed by a safe amount, and the jaw stopped clenching. Even so, when Eleanor touched near the edge of the wound, the fingers still closed around the wood. Eleanor began cutting away more hair around the injury. The coat was so thick that the scissors had to move in short sections. Beneath it was gray-brown skin, thick but flexible, hot with fever. The wound ran diagonally across the lower right abdomen and was deepest in the middle. The damaged edges were uneven, with broad bruising and several shallow punctures set apart like tooth marks. She washed the outer area with diluted antiseptic, careful not to let the chemical run deep into the damaged tissue. Then she flushed the wound in stages with warm saline, washing away old blood, soil, and bits of plant matter. The liquid changed color and ran into the cloth beneath the table. Cole replaced the towels, as instructed, without questions and without showing disgust. He simply did what needed to be done. Once the surface was cleaner, the structures beneath became visible in the oil light. Eleanor saw abdominal muscle far thicker than expected, with bundles crossing in directions similar to primate anatomy, but far denser and larger than anything human. Each bundle was firm and deep, with almost no fat between them. It explained the strength she had already seen in the arms, shoulders, and torso. The surface blood vessels were also larger than expected. One smaller branch still seeped with each pulse. Eleanor used a hemostat, lifted the tissue carefully, and tied it off with absorbable suture. When the clamp took hold, the patient released a very low groan. His hand tightened around the wood, but the rest of his body stayed in place. Eleanor stopped long enough to check his breathing. There was no sign of sudden respiratory failure. She continued opening the wound only as much as necessary to see the deeper area. That was when she understood this was not a simple skin laceration. The muscle beneath had been torn in 2 directions, as if a powerful force had both pulled and twisted the abdomen. The deeper abdominal lining, however, did not appear to be fully open. That discovery gave her cautious hope. If the abdominal cavity had been breached, she would have faced infection, intestinal injury, and internal bleeding that the cabin could not possibly handle. But if the deepest layer remained closed, the main task would be cleaning, stopping the bleeding, removing badly damaged tissue, and rebuilding each layer with sutures. Eleanor used a gloved fingertip to check the limits of the damage. Each time she reached the most painful area, the patient squeezed the wood again. He did not pull away, but the breathing became shorter and ended with a deep vibration on the exhale. She reduced the pressure, waited until the rhythm settled, then continued. That restraint made Eleanor both grateful and uneasy. One arm was long enough to sweep her away from the table. One hand could crush a human wrist. Yet the Bigfoot directed every pain response into a piece of dead wood. It was not helplessness. It was a decision maintained through every painful minute. After controlling 2 bleeding points, Eleanor began trimming the damaged tissue. She removed only the areas that clearly could not recover, preserving as much healthy tissue as possible. Every cut was short and measured. With a body never described in medical literature, keeping as much living tissue as possible was safer than making a wider intervention. Beneath the outer muscle, she noticed that the blood vessels followed an organized pattern similar to the body of an advanced primate. This was not the vague resemblance shared by all mammals. The direction of muscle fibers, vessel placement, and the way the layers crossed suggested a body designed to stand upright, rotate through the torso, and use the upper limbs with great precision. The muscle density, however, was far beyond human anatomy. The bundles were thick, solid, and anchored deeper. That structure fit a Bigfoot capable of moving great weight, climbing steep terrain, and sustaining strength over long distances. Eleanor had read some of the more serious theories about Bigfoot during quiet evenings, mostly out of professional curiosity. Some researchers argued that if Sasquatch existed, the body would have to resemble a primate, but be heavily adapted to cold climates and long-range movement. What she was seeing did not prove any theory, but those ideas no longer felt distant. The thought lasted only a few seconds before the work pulled her back. A deeper vessel began bleeding more heavily when the tissue was lifted. Eleanor clamped it, checked the direction of flow, then tied it with 2 loops of suture. Cole passed the instrument at the right moment, his hand steady, even though his breathing had grown heavier from standing so long. The patient opened his eyes wider as the pain increased, the dark brown eyes fixed on Eleanor. There was no blind panic in them. She saw pain, exhaustion, and caution that had not disappeared. Eleanor realized he understood what she was doing, at least enough to know the pain was connected to an attempt to save him. She placed one hand on the clean hair near his ribs and held it there for several seconds before continuing. It was a gesture she often used with a horse or bear, partly awake under treatment, but this time it felt completely different. Beneath her palm was heat, breathing, and the heavy muscle of a Bigfoot that public science had never recognized. Still, her first response was no longer amazement. The amazement remained somewhere in the background, along with the instinct, reminding her that this patient could kill her if control slipped. But fear no longer guided her hands. What replaced it was pure professional respect. Eleanor saw a body fighting to live, a patient enduring pain without harming the person trying to help. From that point forward, the name of the species no longer mattered. She did not think of herself as operating on a legend. She thought about the depth of each stitch, the right amount of tension, the risk of trapped blood, the possibility of infection, and the need to keep the muscle layers from being pulled too tightly. Eleanor began closing the first deep layer. She used heavy, absorbable suture, placing each stitch at an even distance, so the muscle edges came together without the thread cutting through. Because the tissue was so thick, each pass of the curved needle required more force than usual. She had to rotate her wrist, keep the angle steady, and draw the suture through slowly to avoid causing more damage. The patient reacted to every stitch. He did not struggle, but his breathing deepened and the hand tightened around the wood. Once, the pressure split the piece lengthwise. Cole immediately placed another section beside his hand. The Bigfoot released the broken wood, moved to the new piece with a slow, deliberate motion, and remained still. Eleanor watched that change and understood the behavior was not an unconscious reflex. He knew the object helped him control his own strength. He knew to replace it when the first piece failed. That awareness made her more careful, but it also created an unexpected sense of trust. The patient was cooperating. After closing the deep muscle, she checked the entire wound again. There was no clear bleeding point left. The tissue color improved as the edges returned to position. The pulse remained fast, but it was more regular than before. Eleanor told Cole to hang the fluid bag higher from a hook near the ceiling beam. The solution moved slowly through the line into a large vein in the forearm, supporting circulation without placing a sudden burden on the body. Over the next several hours, the smell inside the cabin changed. Old blood and wet hair slowly gave way to antiseptic, lamp oil, and warm cloth. The fire in the small iron stove burned lower, and Cole added wood whenever Eleanor paused to check the breathing. Each time the stove door opened, red light spread across the walls and made the patient's shadow large enough to cover almost the entire room. Eleanor closed the outer muscle with separate stitches, firm but not overly tight. She left a small opening for drainage instead of sealing the contaminated area completely. Then she flushed the wound one last time, checked the skin edges, and closed them with heavy suture. The thick skin forced the curved needle through in slow stages. Her hands began to ache, and her fingers stiffened from holding instruments for so long. Cole changed hands on the lamp several times. Sweat showed on his forehead, even though the cabin was cold. A working rhythm formed between them, without explanation, as if the silence protected both of them from fully understanding what they were doing. When Eleanor tied the final stitch, she did not step away immediately. She checked the entire closure, cleaned the surrounding area, placed a thick layer of gauze, then secured a bandage around the abdomen with wide strips of cloth. The work was difficult because of the patient's size. Cole had to pass the fabric under his back, while Eleanor maintained enough pressure to keep the dressing from slipping without restricting the movement of the chest and abdomen. The patient's breathing slowed. Each breath was still heavy, but the spaces between them were more even. His eyelids nearly closed. For the first time since the operation began, the hand around the wood loosened. The huge fingers slowly opened, leaving deep impressions in the surface. Eleanor placed 2 fingers against his wrist and counted the pulse again. It remained fast, but it was no longer chaotic. The body temperature was still high, but had not climbed further. The color inside the lip was less pale. Those small changes did not guarantee survival, but they showed that he had made it through the most dangerous part of the procedure. In her exhaustion, Eleanor looked at the body on the table with a completely different feeling than when she had entered. At first, she had seen something that broke every point of reference. Now she saw a patient who had endured hours of pain with a level of restraint few animals, including humans, could have maintained. She did not know how much he understood. She did not know who had brought him to the cabin, why he trusted Cole, or whether other Sasquatch were waiting outside in the woods. Those questions still existed, but they were no longer urgent. What mattered now was watching the breathing, keeping him warm, maintaining the fluids, and making sure the sutures did not begin bleeding again. Eleanor covered the uninjured parts of his body with additional blankets and dry cloth. Cole adjusted the iron stove, then placed one oil lamp near the table, far enough away not to overheat him. The Bigfoot grew slightly. His head turned toward Eleanor. His eyes opened to a narrow slit and found her in the weak light. For several seconds their eyes met without the tension that had been there in the beginning. Eleanor did not see gratitude in the way a human might show it. She saw recognition, exhaustion, and a careful calm. She placed her hand on the hair-covered forearm, avoiding the intravenous line, and kept it there. The muscle beneath her palm slowly relaxed. The patient no longer squeezed the wood. That was the moment Eleanor remembered most clearly, years later. Not the first sight of the Bigfoot's face, and not the strange muscle structure beneath the lamp. It was the moment she realized she had stopped being afraid of him long before she noticed. For hours, her profession had done what reason could not. It had turned the impossible into a series of specific tasks. The wound needed washing, a vessel needed tying, tissue needed closing, breathing needed watching. Once everything was divided into small actions, the boundary between human, wild animal, and legend no longer mattered. Eleanor remained beside the table until the fluid bag was nearly empty. Cole still stood across from her, silently holding the lamp. Neither of them needed to speak about the result. The sutures were holding. Blood was not coming through the dressing. The massive chest continued rising in a more even rhythm. Near dawn, the Bitterroot cabin finally settled into a quiet rhythm. Eleanor had never expected to feel grateful for. The oil lamps had burned low, their blackened wicks casting only thin yellow circles across the wooden walls. Outside, the sky remained dark, but the blackness beyond the window had begun to fade around the edges of the trees. Inside, the patient on the table was breathing more evenly. Each breath remained deep and heavy, but the timing had stabilized. The pulse beneath the wrist was still quick, but strong enough for Eleanor to believe the body had survived the worst part of the night. The Bigfoot opened his eyes when Eleanor stood. The eyelids lifted only partway, but the dark brown eyes found her immediately. The hard caution from when she first entered the cabin was gone. The look remained tired and carried pain that could not disappear after only a few hours, but it was calmer. Eleanor placed one hand on the hair-covered forearm for the last time. Beneath her palm, the muscle no longer held itself ready to fight. The huge fingers rested open beside the cracked wood and did not close again. Cole led her outside as the light began to strengthen between the treetops. The cold air cleared some of the fog from her mind at once. The smell of damp soil and pine resin replaced the lamp oil, antiseptic, and wet hair that had clung to her clothes for hours. Eleanor stood on the porch step and tried to memorize the position of the cabin in the landscape. But the dense trees, moss-covered rock, and weak morning light made every direction look the same. Before they left, Cole placed the equipment case on the ground and asked one thing of her. He did not threaten her or give a long explanation. His voice remained as controlled as it had been during the 2 in the morning phone call. Eleanor had to keep everything secret, never reveal the cabin's location, never speak about the patient, and never return to search. What happened that night had to end there. Cole promised to follow the care instructions she left behind. Eleanor wrote the medication doses, dressing schedule, warning signs, and steps for keeping the sutures clean on several pages from her notebook. She explained each part carefully, then made him repeat it to ensure nothing had been misunderstood. Cole remembered everything faster than she expected. When Eleanor asked whether he could contact her if the condition became worse, he only said he would find a way. In the end, Eleanor agreed to keep the promise, not because she feared Cole, but because the night had shown her that the patient could survive only while remaining outside human attention. If the location became known, the cabin would no longer be a refuge. Curious people, hunters, reporters, and those who wanted to own the evidence would arrive before well-meaning scientists ever could. A Bigfoot who had placed his life in her hands could become a target the moment she spoke. They left the cabin when there was enough light to walk without headlamps. The route back remained steep and difficult, but Eleanor barely remembered any individual section. She remembered only Cole's silence, water moving under stone, and the feeling that each step was carrying her farther away from something she might see only once in her life. When they reached the wooden gate, her vehicle stood exactly where she had left it, covered in a thin layer of mist. Cole placed the equipment case on the back seat. Before turning toward the forest, he looked at Eleanor with a serious expression and reminded her of the promise. She nodded. There was no handshake, no thank you. Cole walked around the gate, entered the trees, and disappeared quickly, as though the forest shadows had already been waiting to hide him. For the next 12 years, Eleanor told no one. She did not enter the patient's name into any record, keep a hair sample, take photographs, or return to Bitterroot to search for the cabin. Even her husband, who stayed beside her through the final years of his life, only knew that Eleanor had come home from one emergency smelling of forest and carrying a look that had changed. He asked a few times, but Eleanor always said it was a matter of professional confidentiality. The first year passed without any sign from Cole or the patient. Eleanor sometimes wondered whether the Bigfoot had survived the recovery period. She thought about infection, the sutures opening during movement, and the possibility of renewed blood loss. No call ever came. The silence lasted long enough that she slowly accepted she might never know the final outcome. Then, during the first week of September the following year, Eleanor arrived at the clinic at sunrise and found a small basket outside the door. The basket had been woven from young willow branches, sturdy but not decorative. Inside were golden chanterelle mushrooms, clean of soil, and arranged in several careful layers. Eleanor recognized them immediately. Chanterelles often grew in mature forests where moisture stayed steady beneath an old canopy. They were not so rare that they could not be purchased. But every mushroom in the basket was equally fresh, picked at exactly the right stage, with no sign that any had come from a store. There was no card, no sender's name, and no clear boot print on the hard ground outside the door. Eleanor asked the staff members who arrived early, but no one had seen anyone leave the basket. She carried the mushrooms inside, examined each one, and placed them on the table. One thought came immediately, but she would not allow herself to trust it. The second year, the basket appeared again during the first week of September. It sat in the same place before the clinic opened. The mushrooms were again golden chanterelles, fresh, clean, and carefully arranged. The new basket had a slightly different weave, but it was made from the same kind of young branches. At the time, the security camera faced only the parking area and did not cover the doorway. Eleanor did not change its position. She knew that if she truly wanted to identify whoever left the basket, she could have done more. But her promise to Cole also meant she would not investigate. The third year came, then the fourth, and the gift continued. Each time, Eleanor woke during the first week of September with an expectation she never admitted to anyone. One year the basket appeared after a night of rain, but the woven branches were almost dry, and only a few drops of water rested on the mushroom caps. Another year, frost arrived early and the basket held fewer mushrooms, but every one had still been chosen with care. There were never any footprints, messages, or requests for something in return. Eleanor began to view the baskets as a simple announcement that the patient had survived. She did not know whether the Bigfoot gathered the mushrooms himself, whether Cole delivered them, or whether someone else in that hidden community carried out the task. But the timing repeated too precisely to be accidental. The operation had taken place in the middle of September. Each basket arrived near the anniversary, like a reminder sent through a language that required no sound. In the 8th year, Iris Marsh was the one who found the basket. Iris was an adult by then, and often came to the clinic to help her mother with paperwork during busy weeks. She arrived early, found the mushrooms outside the door, and carried them inside. At first, Iris assumed a client had sent a gift. But when she saw Eleanor's reaction, she understood that this was not the first time. Eleanor stood still beside the table, one hand frozen halfway through opening the appointment book. Iris asked where the basket had come from. Eleanor gave a vague answer, saying it was a gift from someone from long ago. The explanation did not satisfy her daughter. Iris noticed that her mother seemed to know exactly when the basket would arrive, knew the type of mushroom, and had kept the older baskets stored away. From that day forward, Iris asked about them every fall. She did not pressure Eleanor, but curiosity slowly became concern. An anonymous gift appearing outside the clinic every year could be an act of gratitude, but it could also mean someone had been watching. Eleanor always insisted there was no danger, yet refused to explain why she was so certain. Time continued moving. Eleanor's husband died, clinic employees changed, and Iris became more involved in her mother's work. The baskets still arrived without missing a single week. Every time Eleanor saw one, she remembered the oil lamps, the cracked wood inside the enormous hand, and the dark brown eyes opening near dawn. By the 12th year, Iris did not ask right away. She set the basket on the table, made 2 cups of coffee, and sat across from her mother. Her daughter's silence made Eleanor understand that the promise had reached a different kind of boundary. Cole had asked her not to reveal the location, not to return, and not to bring the outside world to the patient. He could not have known that years later, a daughter would need to understand why her mother carried such a heavy secret. Eleanor told the story for the first time. She did not take Iris to the cabin, because Eleanor herself was not certain she could still find the way. She did not reveal details that might help anyone trace the location. She only described the call. At 2 in the morning, the guide named Cole, the patient on the wooden table, and the hours of surgery beneath oil lamps. At the end, she told Iris about the promise she had kept for 12 years. Iris did not laugh, and she did not ask her mother for proof. She looked at the golden mushrooms inside the basket, then at Eleanor's aging hands. The first thing she understood was not whether Bigfoot existed. She understood that her mother had saved a life, then protected it through silence. Eleanor did not tell the story because she wanted to be believed. She told it because she wanted Iris to understand that professional responsibility does not always end when a wound is closed. Some patients need medicine, some need time, and some lives remain safe only when the person who saved them knows how to keep a door closed. The 12th basket remained on the table between mother and daughter. The smell of fresh chanterelles, forest moisture, and young willow branches spread lightly through the room. To Eleanor, it had never been only a gift. It was a confirmation repeated across many autumns that the patient from that night had lived, had remembered, and in his own way was still keeping his side of the promise. Victor, if Bigfoot is really as intelligent as you say, why haven't we ever seen evidence that they understand gratitude or repay the people who help them? That is a fair question, and I can imagine it coming up after last week's video. We often hear stories about Bigfoot watching people from a distance, warning them of danger, leaving footprints, or disappearing before anyone gets a clear look. But gratitude is something different. It requires memory, recognition, an awareness of debt, and a decision to return after the danger has passed. That is why I want to use Eleanor Marsh's story as a direct answer. What holds my attention most is not the surgery inside the cabin. The detail that stays with me longer is the basket of chanterelle mushrooms that appeared outside the clinic during the first week of September, year after year. One basket could be a coincidence. 2 might have come from someone who knew the story, but 12 baskets arriving in the right season at the same place, without a message or any request in return, form a pattern that is difficult to dismiss as random. I don't think those baskets were only gifts. To me, the consistency matters more than the value of what was inside, because it shows that the memory never faded as one quiet autumn followed another. They feel like a form of payment chosen by whoever left them. Eleanor used her knowledge, her time, and her silence to save a life. In return, someone in the forest remembered what she had done, selected something valuable within that world, and carried it to a place where Eleanor would find it. Nothing more than something gathered from the woods, repeated, often enough for the message to become clear. We still remember. In behavioral biology, There is a concept called reciprocal altruism. One individual helps another with the possibility that the help may be returned in the future. The exchange does not have to happen immediately. But this kind of behavior can exist only when an animal is capable of recognizing individuals, remembering past interactions, and telling the difference between someone who once helped and someone who caused harm. Great apes give us several examples worth thinking about. Chimpanzees can recognize familiar individuals after long periods apart, remember relationships within a group, and change their behavior based on a history of cooperation. Gorillas also show long-term recognition of former group members, caregivers, and familiar individuals. Their social memory does not hold only a face. It connects that face with safety, tension, emotion, and experiences that happened years before. None of that proves Bigfoot exists. It certainly does not prove that a Bigfoot left mushrooms outside Eleanor's clinic. But it does show that the biological foundation for such behavior is not unreasonable. If a large, unclassified being truly shares some relationship with primates, possesses long-term memory, and can recognize individual people, then remembering a doctor who once saved his life is not such a distant step. And here, I want to speak directly to those of you who remain skeptical. Maybe Cole brought the baskets. Maybe someone else who knew the secret continued the ritual to protect it. But even under that explanation, the same question remains. Why continue for 12 years? Why choose the exact week of the surgery? Why never leave a name, a note, or any sign of wanting recognition? Maybe the value of the baskets does not depend on whose hand placed them there. Their value lies in the repetition. Gratitude is rarely measured by one great moment. We recognize it when someone still remembers after everyone else has forgotten, still returns when there is no longer any obligation, and still keeps a promise when no one is watching. Eleanor answered in the same language. She did not return to the cabin. She did not try to collect proof. She did not turn the secret into fame. She remained silent for 12 years, even when the memory became a burden she carried alone. One side left mushrooms at the door. The other protected the location of the forest. That may be the deepest exchange in this story, not between a doctor and a patient, but between two living beings who understood that trust survives only when both sides keep their part of the promise. Now I want to hear your answer. Do you believe wild animals can remember an act of rescue for years and find a way to repay it in a language of their own? Comment "remembered" below, then tell me which detail made you believe the story, or doubt it, the most. Remember, gratitude doesn't always speak. Sometimes it just leaves something at your door every year until you finally understand. I'm Victor, and I'll see you in the next story.